Welcome back, everybody. We're introducing week one of Min 540, Ministry and Culture, where we will be talking about some models of cultural engagement. There's a lot of work to do this week. There's going to be a lot of reading. I know that's probably not your favorite thing to hear right as you begin week one of a new class, but it will lighten up during the course of the class and to get lighter and lighter so you can do that final project by the end of the course. So I want to introduce your assignments and talk a little bit more about where we're going and maybe give you a heads up on how you can be more efficient with your reading and with your time usage for week one. So let's dive right into it. Our first module here is really talking about theories of culture. And so we're going to need to talk a lot about H. Richard Niebuhr and his 1950 book called Christ and Culture. I can't emphasize strongly enough what an important book this is for American theology and Christian ethics. The typology that Niebuhr develops in this book has been significant and lasting, and it's made an impact on academia and institutions of higher learning all across the spectrum, from Notre Dame, where I went to school, Catholic University, to evangelical seminaries and Bible colleges and everything in between. Everyone reads Niebuhr. Everyone thinks about Niebuhr and his categories as the categories for how Christian ethics works and how Christian cultural engagement works. So it's really hard to overstate how significant Niebuhr's work is for defining how the average Christian, the average pastor, the average seminary teacher, how we think about culture. So we have to lay a foundation here for understanding these different types and models in Niebuhr. To do that, I've prepared a couple of lectures for you, which will be available on video, where we'll be able to track through H. Richard Niebuhr and his importance for Christian theology and Christian ethics. So you'll watch those videos, and also available in the resources for Module 1 are two articles. One is by Glenn Stassen, who has recently passed away, but he was an ethicist at Fuller Theological Seminary. The second is by Craig Carter, who is another Christian author who wrote a review of H. Richard Niebuhr's Christ and Culture, kind of a 50th anniversary review. A bunch of books came out during that time, and Craig Carter's was one of them. And in that book, he uses John Howard Yoder, who is a Mennonite, famous well-known Mennonite theologian, to critique H. Richard Niebuhr. The gist of both of these articles is that Niebuhr's Christology is not sufficient. He doesn't have a high enough view of Jesus Christ, his humanity and his divinity, and also we might even add the authority of Jesus' teachings in the Sermon on the Mount. And as a result, Niebuhr's models for how Christians should think about culture are lacking. So that's a big, broad overview of the two articles. But you should read at least one of those to inform the discussions that are coming up. So you'll read those two articles on Niebuhr. You'll listen to the two lectures that I put together for you on Niebuhr. And then you should be taking a look at James Davidson Hunter's book, To Change the World, chapters 1 through 7. So chapters 1 through 7. Now, I'll warn you in advance, Hunter is what I like to call some sleepy time reading. Hunter is not a gripping book. It takes some concentration, it takes some effort. So you'll want to read that at the time of day when you're feeling most awake. It is not hard reading, I've found, but it does make a demand on your mind. You have to stay focused and you have to track with him. Now, let's just say that you do find Hunter to be a little bit of an uphill climb, and you're thinking, I got to read 7 chapters of this. What in the world am I going to do? Let me suggest that you read chapters 2, 4, 6, and 7 of Hunter. That's chapters 2, 4, 6, and 7. And that'll give you the gist, that'll give you the broad overview of his argument in part 1 of To Change the World. Basically, this idea of why doesn't the usual way of thinking about transforming the culture or making an impact on the world, why doesn't that seem to work for Christianity, whether it's on the left or on the right? Why doesn't that work? So he's getting after that. In particular, the heartbeat of that is chapter 4, where he lays out those 11 propositions for Christian cultural engagement. So if you had to pick one chapter, I would say pick chapter 4. But 2, 4, 6, and 7, then ideally if you could read the whole thing, that would be excellent. The last thing that we'll do for the week is you will look at Vanhoozer, chapter 1, and just start to whet your appetite for this idea of cultural texts. What is a cultural text? Why should Christians care? How do I use a cultural text to engage people in ministry? How could it be important for how I think about connecting with people or building bridges to people to do ministry? People are out there in culture. And one of the things that we'll talk about in the first lecture is this word culture is so slippery, it's so hard to define, and yet it seems to be so important for how we think of ourselves as Christians, how we think of ourselves as citizens, how we think of ourselves as God's people. So we'll work on defining culture together. You'll work on defining culture. And we'll also talk about the importance of that definition for ministry and how we build bridges with people who are not yet Christians, how we connect with people who are Christians and relate to the world of the everyday person in our church, in our ministry, and in our work, in our schools. So that's where we're going with Module 1. Let me say a little bit about the assignments. So you've got, for this week, first assignment is your introduction. So make sure you upload a recent picture of yourself so we can get to know you. We can see how tan you are from your vacation, wherever you've been last, and we'll get to have a little personal connection with each other. So introduce yourself to the class. Even if you already know each other, there might be someone new. So first, introduce yourself. Second, we will have a discussion of H. Richard Niebuhr. So you will need to view the lectures from yours truly. You will need to read at least one article, either the Carter article or the Stassen article, on H. Richard Niebuhr's work and maybe a critique of it, why it's not sufficient. I'll inject a few of my own critiques into that as well as I'm doing the lecture, so be listening for that. Second artifact, second discussion that we'll do is a discussion of Hunter. And you'll be interacting with his 11 propositions. So as you read chapter 4 in particular, it's also listed in your curriculum, pay attention to those propositions and weigh them, measure them, evaluate them a little bit. Do I agree with this? Can I think of an example of this? Where have I seen this at work in my life, in my ministry? And specifically, try to connect your thoughts and your comments in the discussion to something that Hunter is saying in chapter 4, or maybe chapters 1 through 7. Somewhere you're going to find something that sparks an interest for you. In assignment 4, you are going to develop an essay in conversation with those 11 theses that Hunter develops. In particular, you're going to focus on the notion of cultural power. Hunter is going to develop a theory that says some groups in culture, in society, seem to have cultural power while other groups don't. And what he's going to say there is that the reason that Christians, either on the right or the left or in the center, a third group with the peace churches, they cannot seem to change the culture because they don't have cultural power. So you're going to need to zero in on that notion of cultural power. Pay attention to what Hunter has to say about cultural power and why Christians have it or don't have it. So pay attention for that in your essay. And fifth, for your weekly reflection, which is submitted through the discussion board forum, for your weekly reflection, you're going to talk about Vanhoozer and this notion of cultural text. Whether or not we can use cultural text, is this intriguing? How does he define a cultural text? Something significant that you learned out of Vanhoozer chapter 1, and that will be the topic for the weekly reflection. Now, we'll get back to the open-ended weekly reflections. What did you learn that was the most significant this week? But for this week, for Module 1, I think Module 2 as well, the weekly reflection will be prescribed for you. So interact with Vanhoozer chapter 1 on the notion of cultural texts. and I will see you online. Have a great week.